Good evening and welcome to another episode of WTFriday. Did y'all listen on Monday night that is, to the episode when I talked about the Murdaugh case here in South Carolina? Well, it's quickly becoming one of the most popular recent episodes. And that was just part one. And on this coming Monday, I'll be wrapping up with what we know so far in part two. Now, there's going to be a part three. It's coming up in the future, and it'll happen either if more stuff comes out or when he, finally goes to trial, or trials, maybe I should say. But anyway, let's go ahead and just jump in and get started with tonight's episode.
Welcome to What the Friday, the After Dark series presented by Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, you know the saying, there's a first time for everything, and of course it's true. So tonight we're going to talk about Georgia's very first mass murder, and it took place way back in 1887 near Macon, Georgia. The murders that I'm going to talk about shocked the entire state of Georgia, and even though that was the first mass murder, I'm sure if something like this happened in modern times, it would be just as shocking. And even though the case was closed long ago and that culprit was hanged for what he did, I'm sure there's plenty of questions still unanswered. But anyway, let me tell you what I'm talking about. So if you hear Stevie in the background, that's her doing her translation for the cats that listen to the podcast. But anyway, so tonight I'm talking about, or the first part I'm talking about, Thomas George Woolfolk. And he was born on his family's large cotton plantation back on June 18th, 1860. And he was the third of three children and the only boy, so it stood to reason that he would inherit his father's estate if and when his father passed away. Well, not long after he was born, his mom, Susan, she died, so Tom and his two sisters were sent to Athens, Georgia, to live with their Aunt Fanny, and this was the sister of his mom, Susan. Well, sometime after that, Tom's dad, Richard, remarried to a woman named Mattie Howard. And not long after they got married, they started a new family together, and they had a total of 6 children. There's not a whole lot known about Tom's childhood other than that the fact that he loved that Aunt Fanny that he had been sent to live with, and he loved her dearly. And we also know that his young years were during the Civil War. But during the time that the new family was being formed that his father was having, Tom came back to live with his dad and that new family. So he was around 7 years old when he moved back in with his dad, but it didn't take him very long to start figuring things out. And seeing that his dad had all these new children, Tom started thinking as he got older about how this is probably just ruining his chances of inheriting everything. And that thought really pissed off Tom. Now, to hear others talk about Tom, it's safe to say that there may have been some mental issues within him. He was described by some who knew him as perverse, eccentric, cranky, and unscrupulous. So there was that. But then there was a young woman named Georgia Bird who had married Tom. She only stayed with him 3 weeks after they got married, and eventually they were divorced. But she said that he wasn't crazy, he was just plain out mean. And she went on to say that he was the meanest person she had ever known, and there was nothing too mean that he wouldn't do. So whether he had mental issues or he was just mean, this guy Tom had some serious issues. And I wonder if maybe he was mean because the thought of not inheriting it all from his father was brewing inside, and it was making all these ill feelings build up. Well, of course, I'm not making excuses, just thinking out loud about what maybe was going on inside his head. So fast forward to 1887, and Tom's now divorced, and he's living on the plantation. Well, on the morning of August the 6th of that year, just before daybreak, he runs to a neighbor's house and tells them that everyone in the house had been murdered. Well, that everyone included Tom's dad, his name was Richard, Tom's stepmom, Maddie, and his 6 siblings from that marriage, which was 20-year-old Richard Jr., 17-year-old Pearl, 10-year-old Annie, 7-year-old Rosebud, 5-year-old Charlie, and 18-month-old baby Maddie, plus an aunt of his stepmom's, and her name was Temperance West. She was 84 at the time of her death. They had all been hacked to death with an axe, and all had been struck in the head or the upper body. And poor little Annie was found kneeling in front of an open window, and it's believed that she was trying to escape. And after he got to the neighbors and asked them to send for help, he ran back to the plantation, and he was there before the authorities arrived on the scene, but it wasn't long before they showed up. And when they did, Tom told them that he had went from room to room checking to see if anyone had survived, and in the process of doing that, he heard the killer or killers leaving through the back door and letting the back gate slam behind them. Well, news travels fast, and it did back in those days too, and over the course of the day, several thousand people showed up there in the at that plantation. And it wasn't long before suspicion fell on Tom. He was acting downright strange, and you would think that he would be upset or he would appear grief-stricken after or not necessarily watching, but witnessing such a horrific crime. But everyone noticed that he was acting somewhat anxious or nervous or maybe even apprehensive. And some that say that they had seen Tom acting strange before the murders, and some folks even said they had seen Tom with the murder weapon, which was an axe, the day before the murders. And on top of that, he had dried blood in his ears and a bloody handprint on his leg. Well, I guess old Tom didn't clean up very well. He had told the authorities that he had survived by escaping out a window. They weren't buying it, and the coroner held an inquest right there on the spot. And the coroner's jury decided that because none of his story added up, and there had been no sign of forced entry anywhere there, at any of the doors of the plantation house, they decided that Tom was the murderer, and the sheriff decided to take Tom on in to keep a lynch mob from forming and killing him. Well, as you can imagine, the press went crazy with the story of Tom and the family that he was accused of murdering. The story even made the front page of the New York Times, and the press nicknamed Tom as Bloody Woolfolk. And get this, it became the most publicized crime in Georgia's history. Well, Tom was indicted on all 9 murders, but when he went to trial, he was only tried for the murder of his father. And the trial was held at the Superior Court in Bibb County, and it started on December 5th of 1887. It only took the jury 12 minutes to decide that Tom was guilty, and on the same day, he was sentenced to be hanged. But the following February, the Supreme Court of Georgia granted Tom a new trial because the trial court had allowed inadmissible testimony to be used during the trial, and also because the court had done absolutely nothing when spectators that were there in the court started chanting, "Hang him, hang him." So a new trial was held in Houston County at the Superior Court, and it started on June the 3rd, 1889. And that trial ended on June 24th, and this time it took the juror, gosh, why am I having a problem with that word today? But it took the jury 45 minutes of deliberation. I can't talk. Maybe I should just let Stevie do the whole thing, but it took them 45 minutes of deliberation. But they also found Tom guilty, and they sentenced him to death on the following day. Well, at both trials, Tom had claimed to be innocent of having anything to do with the murder of his family, but I guess the juries on both trials were not convinced. And on the 29th of October in 1890, Tom was hanged before a crowd of an estimated 10,000 people. When I hear these stories from back in the day when they still hanged people, it just amazes me the amount of people that gather to watch someone be executed. And I think that morbid curiosity and probably wanting to see justice carried out plays a big part, because I've always, low-key, I'm going to say, wanted to watch an execution in modern times. But we'll talk about that some other time. But anyway, while Tom's on the scaffold, just before he was hanged, he again professed his innocence. Now, he's buried near one of his sisters in Orange Hill Cemetery in Pulaski County. And from my understanding, it's one of his sisters from his dad's first marriage to his mom, Susan. Now, the family members that he was found guilty of killing, they're buried at Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon. And I found it very interesting that in the beginning their graves were unmarked, but there have been these brick overlays added to the graves at some point. And then in March of 2005, headstones were finally added to their graves. I just found that interesting because, I have that obsession with cemeteries and graveyards. Well, that's kind of the end of that part of the story, but this kind of connects in, not exactly, but there's a lot of similarities in the case, because almost a century later in Georgia, there is this very comparable case to the Woolfolk murders, and that's the murder of the Alday family in 1973. One thing that makes the two stories very similar is that both families were somewhat prominent families in Georgia. And in both cases, the press had a field day with the stories, and even the trials are similar. And I'm going to tell you all about that. So there was this family, they're the Alday family. They lived in Seminole County in the town of Donaldsonville. Well, Donaldsonville is this quiet little town in the southwest corner of Georgia. And it's dotted with a lot of little farms, or probably even big farms. And there's actually 13 churches in a 4 square mile radius. And that just sounds a lot like the little town I'm from, Whitmire. Now, it was one of those quiet towns that you never heard anything out of, especially crime. But all that changed on May the 14th of 1973. The Aldays lived on one of those farms that I mentioned, and the entire family made their living from that farm. And I'm sure they all felt safe there on that farm, but their sense of security wasn't what they imagined it was. There was a young man named Carl Isaacs. He was a troubled young man, and when he was 19 years old, he found himself incarcerated at Poplar Hill Correctional Institute in his home state of Maryland. And it just so happened that he was incarcerated with his half-brother, Wayne Coleman, who had already been there for several months when Carl began his sentence there. Now, it was not a long time before these two brothers started putting together a plan to escape from Poplar Hill, along with the help of their friend George Dungy. And he was incarcerated for not paying his child support, and he was actually due to be released soon. Well, after they escaped, they pick up the Isaac's younger brother, Billy, and they went on a joyride that included terrorizing Maryland and Pennsylvania by breaking into homes and pulling other theft jobs. Well, one astonishing fact about their escape is there wasn't a big manhunt underway for them, because none of them were considered dangerous criminals, and the four decided to actually stay in the Baltimore area for 2 days after they escaped. Well, at some point, this group of thugs found themselves in Donaldsonville on the way back from Florida, and they were in need of gas for the Thunderbird they had stolen along the way. And I should mention here, that the owner of that Thunderbird, he mysteriously disappeared. But anyway, they have ran out of money, probably riding on fumes, and they come across a farm. Well, this farm that they found had this big gas tank sitting all alone in the middle of a field. And they decided, let's go check out that gas tank. And probably thought about filling their car up with it. Well, the farm that they happened upon was that of the Alday family. And none of the Alday family members were in sight when they approached that gas tank. So they felt like it was their lucky day. Well, they also saw a mobile home sitting there on the farm. So they decided to ransack it, probably looking for stuff they could steal and then sell to fund their joyride, their time out of prison, or whatever you want to call it. Well, while they're doing all this, Jerry Alday and his dad, Ned, show up to the pump to get gas for the farm equipment that they're using. And it surprised our little group of criminals. Well, the two Alday men were outnumbered and they were unable to fight off the thugs. So they were forced into that mobile home and shot in the backs of their heads. The autopsy showed that Ned had been shot 6 times by 2 different pistols. One of those was a .22 caliber and the other was a .32. Now, a little bit later, Jerry's brother, Jimmy, showed up on his tractor, and nearly the same thing happened to him, but he was forced to lay down on a couch there in the mobile home before he was shot. Well, while the men were attempting to hide Jimmy's tractor, Jerry's wife, Mary, she showed up after she had been shopping for groceries. They took her into the mobile home, restrained her, and then she was raped by Carl and Wayne on her own kitchen table. Well, after that, Jerry's brother Chester and their uncle Aubrey showed up, and they were executed in the same manner that the other men had been. Well, Mary was still alive through those last 2 killings. But she wouldn't be for long. The murderers drove her out into the woods that were several miles from their farm. They dragged her out of the car by the hair of her head, raped her again, and then murdered her. And at one point before murdering her, they took photos of her with an Instamatic camera. In those photos, one of them that was found, she was nude and she was visibly terrified. And I can imagine you would be very terrified in this, situation, and mortified, and I don't know, so many words. You've witnessed these murders, and I'm pretty sure she saw the bodies of the others that had been murdered. But, and a sad extra detail to this is that when Mary's mom learned the details of her daughter's death, she went into a diabetic coma and she passed away a few hours later. But as we know, most criminals aren't very smart, and neither were these guys. They left the car they were driving not too far from where they had left Mary's body, and took Mary's car, where they later abandoned it over in Alabama. And from my understanding, Donaldsonville's not very far from the Georgia-Alabama line. But anyway, once they were in Alabama, they stole another car. And I guess at some point, they gave up on going back to Florida because they were arrested a few days later in West Virginia. And when they were arrested, they were found to be in possession of weapons that matched the ones that had been used in the murders of the Alday family. Plus, they had some of the items that belonged to the family that they had taken from that trailer or mobile home. Well, Billy Isaacs, that's the one that was young, he cooperated fully with the police and agreed to testify against his brother in exchange for a 20-year sentence for the armed robberies. While he was being interviewed for a documentary, Carl Isaacs confessed to a filmmaker to the murders of Jerry, Ned, Aubrey, and Jimmy, along with raping Mary and burglarizing that mobile home. Well, that confession was later introduced as evidence when he went to trial. Now, Carl, Wayne Coleman, and George Dungy were tried in Seminole County, where they were found guilty of their crimes and sentenced to death. But in a plot twist to this, those sentences were overturned by the 11th Circuit U.S. District Court of Appeals in 1985 because they thought that the pool of juries had been tainted because of the pretrial publicity. In 1988, they were retried and their convictions were upheld, but the only one that was sentenced to death was Carl Isaac. The other two, they received this life sentence, and Isaac was executed on May the 6th of 2003 by lethal injection. And at that time, he was like the longest serving death row inmate in the U.S. He had been on death row for 30 years when he was finally executed. Well, nearly 3 years later, Dungy died from a heart attack on April 4, 2006, at the age of 68. And Billy, who was that little brother of Carl, passed away 36 years to the day that his brother had escaped from prison. He was living in Florida, and he was 51 years old. And I'm going to back up a little bit because I want to share this, because on the day of their funerals, the mayor of Donaldsonville called for a day of mourning, and all the civic and commercial activities came to a halt. Now, stores in the town closed, and the town basically looked like a ghost town. And because of the large number expected to attend the service, it was decided to hold the multi-person funeral on the cemetery grounds because their church, which was a church that Ned had helped to build, couldn't hold everyone along with the 6 caskets. And there were so many floral arrangements that had been sent by various people. They were stacked on top of each other around the caskets at the funeral. In the eulogy that was delivered at the service, all of the members of the family were praised as really hard workers and for being just these really good, all-around good people. 6 amazing, hardworking people were murdered on that day in May. Now, things like this, they never make sense to me. I mean, why couldn't they just take the gas or the belongings out of the mobile home and leave? Honestly, I really believe that the Aldays were such good people that they probably would have given him anything they had wanted. And honestly, to a point, I hope these things never make sense to me, because once you start understanding, I don't know, I've got these weird feelings about understanding why people do these things. But anyway, y'all, that's all I have for tonight's episode. That's all Stevie has for tonight's episode of What the Friday. Y'all don't forget to come back for the second part of my take on the Murdaugh fiasco that's happening here in South Carolina. Y'all have a good evening.